Hi, and thank you for joining me for another lecture. And friends, today we're on Haftarat Vayeitzei, which is in Hosea Perek Yud Bet, Pasuk Yud Gimel till Perek Yud Dalet, Pasuk Yud, which is Hosea chapter 12 verse 13 till chapter 14 verse 10. Okay, starting out, Perek Yud Gimel reads, Kedaber Ephraim, retet nasahu beYisrael, vayesham beBaal vayamot. When Ephraim spoke rebuke, he was uplifted in Israel, but when he sinned with Baal, he died. Ve'ata yosifu lachato, v'ya'asu lachem masecha mekaspam. Kituna matzabim maaseh harishim, kulo lehem hem. Omrim zovchei adam agalim yishakun. And now they continue to sin, and they made themselves molten idols from their silver, idols in those images, entirely the work of artisans. Of them they say, those who offer human sacrifice kiss calves. Now, this is a very interesting pasuk, one which even sometimes is a bit difficult to translate in terms of the actual context that's being referred to. And it's always, at least to me, as well as to a few others I've heard comment on this Haftarat, a statement that is warning us of the danger of elevating and even venerating the lives of animals above or on the same plane as human lives, as well as when others exclude or write off other individuals just because they happen not to agree with their position on the issue, whether it's done toward meat eaters or vice versa. And again, we're referring to the pasuk that says, Zovchei Adam agalim yishakun, that those who offer human sacrifice kiss calves. And friends, I don't think this is just referring to Hindus worshipping cattle, or like it states in Torah that the Egyptians venerated their livestock to such an extent that if the Jews would have sacrificed them in front of them, they would have risked losing their lives, which is what we see today with radical groups like PETA, who equate the barbecuing of chicken to Jews being burned in the Holocaust, which they kindly named Holocaust on your plate. Elevating animals not just to the level of humans, but sometimes showing even more compassion towards animals than to humans, which is why those who are typically the advocates of no animal testing or no animal consumption in general, or support groups like PETA, disproportionately are those who support abortion, telling us that the life of a chicken is more important than that of an unborn child. And again, we're referring to the pasuk that says, Zovchei Adam agalim yishakun. And friends, I think this is a good time to discuss vegetarianism in scripture or in Judaism. And friends, you must know that the consumption of meat in Judaism is surrounded by only a few mitzvot. Some commanding you to directly eat meat and some indirectly. Now, first and foremost, you must understand that it's an actual mitzvah to eat meat. And I'm not just speaking about Oneg Shabbat, which is rabbinic, but still binding, but it's an actual mitzvah. For example, the Korban Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, it's a law from the Torah that every Israelite must consume the meat of the Passover sacrifice on Passover, at least a kazayit's worth. But he or she must still eat from it. I mean, what do you think the Afikomen represents? The Jewish version of the Catholic wafer, lahavdil. Yes, the Afikomen represents the lamb meat that we would consume on Pesach. Korbanot, or the Zevachim in general, as it's also commanded that every Jew is to eat the meat of the Zevach, or Korban Shlamim, the peace offering or sacrifice that was brought on the altar. Not to mention a command to priests to all consume the vast majority of sacrifices that were offered. So eating meat, yes, was a biblical reality, at least at one time. However, the main argument proposed by religious vegetarians, both Jewish and Christian, is usually based on the literal fact that Adam and Chava did not eat meat. Sometimes the reference in the book of Daniel is also mentioned, but that's really not applicable, mainly because the reason that Daniel only ate vegetables was because no kosher meat was available. But anyways, the idea that Adam and Chava did not eat meat, at least in the rabbinical world, was also not monolithic. For example, Tosfos mentions that the actual prohibition was on man killing animals to then eat them, stating that if the animal died on its own, that this in some way made the animal kosher for consumption. And if I remember correctly, there's a midrash that teaches that a malach, an angel, would come down to slaughter all their meat for them. But this is just a midrash. And if killing animals was prohibited, didn't Chava didn't Abel kill an animal to offer to Hashem in the early chapters of Bereshis, which tells us that the biblical idea or biblical vegetarianism is not based off of not wanting to kill animals. And the truth is that it does seem a bit interesting on why does the narrative of the Torah begin as such, limiting the consumption to only plant matter, which tells us that they didn't even eat fish, lest someone making the argument for biblical universal vegetarianism wants to then include fish in their diet. Now, this should make you think on what were the animals eating, because the understanding is that the animals were also limited to plant life as well. But regardless, after we see the text begin limiting our diets to plant matter, we see that after the Mabul, after the flood, the Almighty allows it. And again, no reason is given for this either. So at least biblically, no one could say that it's wrong to kill animals, at least for food. And in terms of what man was ethically created to consume, you mustn't lose sight on the fact that we are omnivores. In other words, our stomachs were created to be able to digest, apart from just plant matter, meat as well, which cannot be said for most creatures. Not to mention that the early civilizations could not have survived in a healthy manner without the protein found in meat and in fish. In other words, most societies lack the innovations we have in the food industry of today, of the soy meat alternatives and the other protein and iron substitutes conveniently found in our markets. Now, the Gemara does mention a taiva, a lust that man has for meat, that it's not just a regular craving, which at least from an ethical perspective seems that we should in a way resist the urge to eat meat. But again, this sentiment is not really shared in the Torah. And it's really on this basis that famous rabbis like Rabbi Albo and Rabbi Soloveitchik supported the notion of at least being ideological vegetarians. In other words, acknowledging that lust, but of course, still eating what Torah requires. Now, Rabbi Albo in his Sefer HaIkarim goes a bit further, stating that if one consumes too much meat, that it would even encourage him to want to kill others. An idea that's a little bit absurd, which is why Rabbi Albo reminds the reader not to fall into the trap of equating humans with animals, which is what groups like PETA have done today. And also, Rav Kook also agreed with a lot of these reservations. But while considering himself a pretty strict vegetarian, he would actually eat a little piece of chicken on Shabbat and on Yom Tov. Now, there are other rabbis like the former chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who never ate meat on Shabbat or on Yom Tov. And my friend Gil Locks in the Old City also does the same. Now, the Rambam brings it down in the most direct fashion of them all. In Mishneh Torah, even in his commentary to the Mishnah, as well as in Sefer HaMitzvot. And he not only mentions eating meat on Yom Tov, which everyone would agree is a real obligation, but he even mentions it for Shabbat as well, under the auspices of Oneg, of delighting on Shabbat. And the Shulchan Aruch seems to agree and state the exact same thing. And the notion of Oneg Shabbat actually originates out of Sefer Yeshayahu, where Yeshayahu mentioned the obligation to delight on the Sabbath. The problem is that in that sugya, in Masechet Shabbat, dealing with Oneg Shabbat, it does not state that one must consume meat for it to be an Oneg. It actually brings down other examples of non-meat dishes that Chazal personally enjoyed under Oneg, beets, etc. Not to mention that for sure, there is no obligation to eat fish on Shabbat. That's actually just a mystical tradition. So if you enjoy eating meat, you should eat it on Shabbat to delight in Shabbat, but if you don't, you shouldn't. A point that's actually made by the Shulchan Aruch Harav, to give Chabad some credit. Not to mention that the Tanya in Perek Zion states that the highest level an animal can achieve is to be consumed by humans. So, according to the Tanya, we're almost doing them a favor. Now, the rabbis I quoted ate meat on Shabbat, although they were weekday vegetarians for either adhering to the Mishneh Torah or Shulchan Aruch, or because of their community's cultural norms, but they couldn't say that it was because it appeared by Chazal. Now, eating meat on Yom Tov is a completely different issue. How? Because we have a separate mitzvah of simcha on Chagim, on Jewish holidays. And although Shabbat is also considered a Yom Tov, it is excluded from this mitzvah. In other words, there's no mitzvah of simcha on Shabbat. And the way meat is connected with simcha is from the Gemara in Pesachim, where it states, Ein simcha ela bebasar ve'yayin, that Rabbi Yehuda states that there is no simcha, that there is no joy without meat and wine. So this really, at least on the outset, seems to obligate us to eat meat and wine on Yom Tov. The thing is that this really is not applicable today. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda here was talking about the sacrifices we would eat on Chagim after they were sacrificed. And don't forget, today we don't offer sacrifices. And also, one could also say that if the eating of meat does not bring you at least a little joy, this does not apply to joy. In other words, it does not cause simcha. Now, eating meat outside of the context of sacrifices was referred to as basar taiva, or meat that one craves or has an appetite for. So because of this, Chazal established halachot to include laws for meat that were not sacrificed. So what? So we can eat. But because as you know, that every piece of meat that was consumed in and after the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, came from animals sacrificed at the Mishkan. To the point that the word korban is related to lekarev, to come close, because this is how people connected with God. Actually, zevach is the actual word the Torah translates as sacrifice. And like we said earlier, that it's a zevach shlamim, or like we said, the korban shlamim, or peace offering, that was able to be eaten by the person bringing the offering. And like we said, that the rest were eaten by the priests, if they were eaten at all. Now, all this I just mentioned regarding the eating of meat should be under the auspices of being aware of the prohibition of sar balei chaim, of causing animals unnecessary pain or torturing animals, which, as you know, is prohibited. So, regarding animal rights, friends, the only rights animals have in Torah is the right not to be tortured. So, long story short, if you don't like meat, you don't have to eat meat. But if you do, you should eat it on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and for sure on Shavuot, no matter the custom that has developed of eating dairy. And then the Haftarat continues chastising Ephraim, chastising the northern kingdom of Israel. It reads in Perek Yud Gimel Pasuk Yud Daled, Miyad shuefdem mimavet egalem, achi devarecha mavet achi katavcha, shel nocham yisater meinai. From the power of the grave, or what some translate as hell, I would save them. From death I would redeem them. But I will speak with you of death. I will cut you off to the grave. Comfort will be hidden from my eyes. Now, there has been a lot of controversy surrounding the word Sheol on what could that term possibly mean. Does it just mean death or the grave? Or can it possibly also be referring to hell itself? And friends, I think that this might be a good time to discuss the concept of hell in Judaism. Does it exist? Do Jews believe in it? And most importantly, is it mentioned or sanctioned in Torah? First of all, the only word used to justify the concept of hell in Torah is the word Sheol, or at least how it's understood nowadays. Many are probably wondering about the word most commonly used in the Jewish world for hell today, which is the word Gehenna. And in case you're Israeli, Azazel never means hell in the Jewish Bible, nor by Chazal. Remember that the next time someone tells you Lech le'Azazel, the Israeli equivalent to go to hell. And regarding the literary word of Gehenna, you would probably be surprised to learn that the word Gehenna never appears in Torah. Actually, the word never really appears in Tanakh. Now, in Tanakh, or Nach, outside of the Torah, we do find a place renowned for its idol worship that was located right outside the walls of Jerusalem, known as Gei Ben Hinnom, which literally means the valley of the son of Hinnom. That was actually historically the place where pagan worshippers would offer their children to Moloch by burning them on a fiery altar. Also, around the time of the Second Temple, this valley was also said to be used as a dump, and also as the place where the Roman legions would cremate their dead. So, after a while, this place took on an image of what a future place of torment would look like. Actually, the word Gehenna first began to be used in the Talmud to refer to, like we said, Gei Ben Hinnom, again, the valley of the son of Hinnom, which is how the notion of hell, at least how it's accepted in the rabbinic Jewish world, was developed. Now, the notion of Gehenna in the rabbinic world was never understood to be a place of eternal damnation, but rather only a place where a Jew would spend a maximum of 12 months so that he or she could in a way purify themselves before entering Gan Eden, before entering paradise. But remember, all these ideas and tales were only classified as Agadah, in other words, 100% Jewish legend. They were in no way obligatory beliefs. In other words, friends, they are 100% disposable. But regardless, this notion of Gehenna later had incorporated into it the idea of saying Kaddish for the dead, that, as they teach, gets your relative out of Gehenna quicker, an idea you must know appears nowhere in Tanakh nor the Talmud. Really, it's identical to the Catholic purgatory. And by the simple, silly fact that today you can pay someone to say Kaddishes for your dead relatives, you have indulgences present as well. Now, according to the rabbinic, there is a notion of eternal punishment, a place known as So'ar Rotachat, literally a place of boiling excrement. According to our sages, this place is only reserved for the gravest of sinners, which Chazal, our sages, teach are those who mock them, the sages themselves. Funny, huh? Not for murder, nor for rape, or desecrating God's name, but for mocking the sages. I must remind you that this is just another disposable Agadah. But regardless, according to the Zohar, unlike the residents of Gehenna who supposedly get out for Shabbat, those in Tzoar Rotachat never get out, which is where rabbinic literature teaches is where Jesus was placed. And friends, in an attempt to really give you a more monolithic view of the Jewish idea of hell, I tried to connect all the different sources to at least give you an understandable idea of what is known as Gehenna. Because the truth is that the beliefs regarding what this place actually is in no way monolithic. In other words, every rabbi had a different understanding of what it was and what really happens there. And regarding Sheol, the term really just means grave in Tanakh. And a few references made to it by our sages usually always compares it to Gehenna itself, mainly because it typically always leads to it. However, we cannot deny that in Tanakh the term 9 out of 10 times refers only to where the dead reside, many times described even having a gate, which would actually make me assume that it is just another word for a family grave or the tomb equivalent, where the bones of the family dead were kept, which also typically had gates and were sometimes dug on the side of a mountain and many times even underground. So to put it all in perspective, I would say that Sheol is the place of the dead, literally, like we said, the family grave. But within Sheol, you have either Gehenna, which is the place of punishment, or Gan Eden, the place of rest or reward or paradise. So ultimately, what does this tell us about hell in Judaism? Friends, it teaches us that the details regarding it were all made up by many different individuals from virtually no relevant biblical sources. So what am I saying? Well, basically, everything you ever heard about hell at most was just made up from those sources, or at least only appears in Agadot within Jewish literature, which is Jewish legends, which I don't have to tell you, do not bind you in any way to believe it. And friends, the idea, even of the Christian notion of hell, was just built off of the many Jewish and even pagan stories about the supposed place of torment. Now, the closest notion found in Torah to the notion of hell is actually not Sheol or the later Gehenna, but actually the term karet, the idea of being cut off. Now, 9 out of 10 times the word karet, or to be cut off, refers to being cut off from this earth or from your people. But a handful of times the notion of being cut off from above is also mentioned. Now, literally, when it states that if you do X or Y, you will be cut off from your people, at least according to the Torah's literal meaning, what it actually means is that you're no longer part of the children of Israel. And on what basis am I saying this? Well, on the basis of the principle of Ein Mikra Yotze Midei Pashuto, that a verse does not depart from its literal meaning. Now, Chazal teach that this could possibly mean, that karet could possibly mean, if I remember correctly, at least 8 different things, telling us that no one really knew. And I know that Jews typically get upset when someone understands a term literally, but that's what you're supposed to do when grammatically and contextually a term fits its narrative. But like I said, that the idea does appear of a supernatural cutting off, like it states in Parashat Netzavim, of being cut off from above and not just from below. Now, there's also the reference in Torah which the Almighty states that He will blot you out of His book. But that pasuk is really obscure, and no one really understands what could that possibly be referring to. Some link it with being allotted another year of life around Rosh Hashanah, but this is really, at least according to the text, just speculation. And friends, all this talk about hell, although the notion was prevalent in rabbinic sources, didn't really creep into the Jewish religious theological world till the creation of the Musar movement. Now, the Musar movement was the Jewish ethical movement. And honestly, no other movement used the concept of hell to scare Jews into submission like that movement, like the Musar movement. And the question is, why bother bashing Jews with a notion that the Torah never mentions, meaning the idea of hell? Even many rabbis like Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote on the dangers of focusing on a place of punishment as a deterrent for doing evil, on how it could even end up driving people mad. Even the Talmud makes a famous statement that a man who focuses on what's above, on what's below, on what's in the past and what's in the future, it's better if that person was never born. It seems that the reason that the Torah didn't focus on places like hell or even heaven was most likely because it wanted us to keep Torah, or in other words, do good for goodness sake, for what happens in this world and not because of fear of punishment or reward in the next life. To the point that this notion of hell and even an afterlife has been used to keep people away from embracing Torah. Because, as we all know, there was a rabbinic legend that non-Jews who kept only 7 laws would be saved from some place of punishment and allotted a place in the afterlife with Jews. This was actually used to inspire non-Jews to reject the bulk of the Torah's ethical code for only 7 primitive laws. And worse, it has even gotten communities to completely eliminate their conversion programs on the basis on why would a non-Jew want to keep Torah if he can be saved from hell by just keeping 7 laws. Like we said, that this was only a Jewish legend about the afterlife, a legend that many rabbis disagreed with. But because it was taken seriously, it has kept many from embracing a life of Torah. So much for doing good for goodness sake. Now, I understand why at least ethically it would be necessary to believe that a good and just God would not secure the same fate for the righteous alongside the wicked. But this should only really be left up to personal belief and not doctrinally inserted into Judaism, which is pretty much the Christian approach as well, on how the first line commonly used by missionaries is that if you died right now, how do you know you're not going to hell? Nothing about ethics, nothing about repairing this world. In other words, friends, forget about an afterlife and focus on the here and now. And I think that's enough on that subject, and I think we'll end here today. Please join us next week for the following Haftarat. And for more information on everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.org. Thank you.